My name is Pilsum Master. I'm a geologist by profession and not an archaeologist, but archaeology and history are my hobbies and interests. And I've been working on this project for a few years right now. And part of this was in the Fezana Journal for the last 3 or 4 issues. It was in 3 parts. What the topic today is using archaeology and linguistics to determine the time and location of our prophet Zarathustra. We will determine that Zarathustra in Vishtaspa's time was between 2100 and 1600 BCE. That BCE is before the Common Era, which used to be called BC in the past. And it was in the Middle Bronze Age, and his location was in Central Asia. We will do this by identifying the specific characteristics of the society in which Zarathustra's time was. That is the Indo-Iranian or the Aryan society, as it has been called by archaeologists and linguistics. And how, where, and when it developed. And to do this, we will be using the clues from the Gathas and the Rigveda, and I have it in question marks because during later on in the talks, I'll explain why the connectivity between the Rigveda and our Avesta is being sort of used, but it is a tenuous connection. And also from the Soviet era archaeology in the Ukraine, Russia, and Central Asia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of this information has now been made available to Western scholars, and a lot has been written about it, most of it in Russian, but a lot of translations in English are now also available, including a very good book by Anthony, which I have used extensively in this talk, and also by using the clues from the historical linguistics. I'm just going to briefly put this table up because I've been mentioning these time frames frequently in my talks. Don't expect you to remember these dates. The main thing is in the magenta in the Middle Bronze Age, between 2000 and 1550 BCE is the period in which we will be most interested. At the bottom of most slides, as you can see in the footnote, I have the short forms and the dates, so you don't have to remember them. You can refer to it in the next few slides. Another thing to remember is you have to add 2000 to determine the years before present to any of these BCE dates. So are there any clues in the Gatha contents regarding the time and place of Zarathustra? We know from the Gathas that Zarathustra lived in a pastoral society, and it was not a peaceful society, and this is a very important clue. We had these peaceful herdsmen harassed and attacked by an elite section of warriors in their own society who raided them to acquire cattle and horses, which was the main wealth in those days. And Gathas lack references to towns or to commerce, unlike the other urban centers in Mesopotamia and in Central Asia. But these conditions alone do not provide unique characteristics to identify Zarathustra's society's time and place. We need more than that. We cannot rely on any historical records because most of this is in prehistory, although by 3500 BCE, a lot of written records were available in Asia from the Mesopotamian societies. But Iranians did not appear in the historical records until about 800 BCE, and that was from the Assyrian records of their conquest. Perhaps a more precise and acceptable determination is possible by determining when and where Gothic societies developed using additional criteria from the relatively recent publications of Soviet-era archaeology in Eurasia, and by using historical linguistics, starting from the language of the Gathas. And I'll briefly explain what historical linguistics are and why they are so important. On this slide, on the right-hand side, on the top corner, is a language tree. And I'm sorry, but it's not very visible, but at the bottom here, here, and here, are 2 languages, which is the archaic Iranian of the Gathas and the Old Indic of the Rigveda. And they are sister languages, and they are branching off from a Proto-Iranian language over here, which is also called the Proto-Indo-Iranian, which in turn is derived from a Proto-Indo-European, which is the mother of all of these European languages that you see in the language tree. Another thing over here I can point out is that both the Proto-Indo-European and the Proto-Iranian languages, and you have the short form used in archaeology and linguistics shown here, both of them had an immediate ancestor. The important thing on this slide I want to point out is the word Aryan or Aryanness. We do not imply any kind of a race or superiority of some language or religious group. It is simply conceived as a religious linguistic category in the text of the Rig Veda and the Avesta, and is identified by archaeologists as characteristics of an Indo-Iranian population of Central Asia, Iran, and South Asia. So where is the importance of historical linguistics come in, and how does it work? Etymology is essentially a term used for the history of words. There are two criteria that linguistics have developed, and this is a very good science right now. They have determined that language change or replacement rate for phonology, which is sounds, syntax, or word order and morphology, occurs at 10 to 20% per 1,000 years. And also linguists have noticed that language change is not random. The structure of required sound changes is governed by rules, the same rules that exist in all human minds. Our physiologies govern how sound changes occur. And therefore, they can predict what sound changes are or were going backwards in time. Possible, therefore, to follow back thousands of years from the speakers of Avestan and Indic languages to the root of all Indo-European languages, that is the Proto-Indo-European. Proto means first, and it is known as PIE in short. And working in conjunction with archaeological and data and locations and age of the PIE speakers, we can see the daughters that have formed from them, like the Old Avestan and Rigvedic. It may be possible to determine what the whole vocabulary was, both of these Old Avestan and the Rigvedic, and from there you can work backwards. A good example at the bottom that I've shown here is using well understood Old Persian from about 1000 to 500 BCE. The terminal date when the Old Avesta of the Gathas was spoken works out to around the middle of the second millennium BCE, about 1500 BCE. That is, about that time is when the Gatha or the Old Avesta of the Gathas ceased to be a spoken language. When and where did these Gatha societies develop? That is, we are going to use additional criteria from archaeology and historical linguistics to determine this. And the most important one is in this Pontic-Caspian steppes north of the Black Sea. This is the whole steppe area right from there going into Kazakhstan. The Ural Mountains are here. And in this area, shown in the magenta, is a culture called the Yamnaya, which is a Russian word for pit. So these people were recognized by archaeologists. They dug pits for graves and built kurgans, which is a whole series of mounds built on the prairies. And the Russians have found several hundreds of these spread all over from the Hungarian plains, going all the east into Siberia and then into Central Asia. So this was the first culture that started using this. They were the first nomads on the steppes. They had wheel wagons that allowed them to move around, and they were also developed the horse as a mode of transport and used them for herding. They are also suspected to be the first speakers of the Proto-Indo-European language, the mother of all Indo-European languages, including Avesta and all our Indian languages. There's another thing that they did is by about 3300 to 1900 BCE, they also intruded into the Danube River basin and went into the Hungarian plains, over the Carpathian Mountains, and also into Europe. And that is where all the branch Indo-European languages started. Now, several characteristics common to all steppe cultures developed here. Most important was, as I said, the development of the PIE language and the European daughter languages. So how and why did Gathic societies develop? And most important thing is that these people, although they were nomads, they came into contact with fairly advanced urban cultures in the boundaries of the steppes. But they became a predominant culture. They superimposed their language and their culture onto these more advanced societies. And we can wonder, why did it happen? Now, according to Anthony, who's one of the archaeologists who has used this Soviet-era archaeology, there are several factors that came into play. One of these was that horses. These people bred really fantastic horses. And they used the horses to raid all these agricultural communities within the steppes and on the margins of the steppes. This caused so much distress among these agricultural societies that they could no longer function. So all the choices they had was to join the tormentors. This increased the demand for horses and, of course, made the steppe people more rich. And the destruction of the settled way of life forced the adoption of migratory society customs, such as the mutual obligation of hospitality offered to people who accepted the new rules and were under the new social umbrella. And one other thing that archaeologists have found is that the steppe societies had created an elaborate ritual around funerals for their chiefs, with feasting on meat and mead, elaborate gift-giving, and favors by the new chiefs was granted to the clients. And these events enforced the new identity on the newcomers and also was useful for recruiting new members. But so far, these additional criteria do not satisfy all the characteristics of the Indo-Iranian or Aryan cultures, as described in the old Avesta and literature and the Rig Veda. And also, same characteristics that have been found in the artifacts and the material cultures that was discovered at archaeological sites on the steppes in Central Asia. So what are these special characteristics? So these are the Indo-Iranian or Aryan characteristics that identified our ancestors, both the ones that became the Rigvedic Aryans and the Iranians themselves. I'll just briefly listed them over here. Most important was the cultic significance for the horse, fire, and ancestors. Kurgan burials, as I mentioned, these are the pit burials covered by mounds. And these were restricted to chiefs and warriors with hereditary rights and their families. Children's graves have been found like in that too. A pastoral lifestyle where cattle became predominant and cow and dairy products were considered essential. In fact, this was probably their sole source of food. A strata of elite semi-nomadic chariot warriors within that society that raided the pastoralists and urban centers on the steppe margins. This thing is now in the Gathas also. Presence of Bactrian camels indicated for the first time, no longer horses and cattle alone and sheep. Increasing trade in bronze tools and weapons and horses with urban non-Indo-European cultures, and then a contact with these urban cultures causes change in the language and cultural characteristics of the steppe society itself. So it's a two-way thing. For example, gray ware ceramics, which became a distinct archaeological markers for Iranian cultures, began to be made with a potter's wheel, a technology that they derived from these urban cultures that they came into contact with. Also, nomadism was not always prevalent. They always had a fortified settlements, which they were forced to build to protect resources for mines of copper that they found and tin, and also to protect pasture for their herd animals. Another important thing was the chief-client oath-bound relationships and societal rules now clearly defined and distinguish the Arya, and I spell Arya with an I because that is an Iranian spelling, while Arya with an R only is a Sanskrit or Vedic one. And those people who did not belong to the culture were called the Anarya or the Dasyu. And rules for hospitality and mutual obligations were reinforced. So are these cultures with a specific characteristics should exhibit in the archaeological record the same Aryan characteristics as described in the Rig Veda and the Old Avesta. And these Indo-Iranian cultures developed in the Bronze Age. And there are three things that I found that was important for their development. One was the development of a dominant steppe culture. Two, required a trade and conflict with a growing and advanced urban society at the steppe margins, and migration of steppe cultures into this urban society territory for control of trade goods and expansion of power and influence. So these three factors we were able to use to determine where and when Zarathustra and Vishtaspa existed. Between 2100 and 1800 BCE, these events contributed to the development of the Irano-Aryans. And between 1800 and 1600, it was further development of the Irano-Aryans, and also the Indo-Aryans came into play. So first, event one. And I've split the time frame from 2100 to 1800, and we'll talk from 1800 to 1600. The first thing was the predominant steppe culture. This was called the Sintasta, which is shown in red over here. This is the Ural Mountains coming down here. This is the Pontic-Caspian steppes. And then east of the Pontic Ural Mountains is this culture, the Sintasta, and the sister culture, Petrovka. These names are derived, they didn't call themselves that. That was obviously a name given to the location in which the archaeological remains were found. Sintasta River is there. Petrovka is a small village in Kazakhstan. And the Srubnaya, which is shown on the west here, which is a sister culture, which is still nomadic, is named after the Russian word for scrub, because they used to have timber graves. They used to line their graves with timber, and that's how this name came to be derived. These people spoke probably a sister pre-Iranian language, but let's concentrate on the Sintashta here. The Sintashta developed a kind of almost a technological society. Soviet archaeologists have uncovered 20 fortified settlements, including Arkheim, which is about there, not very far from the Baikonur Soviet place where they launched their rockets. And in fact, Putin went in a helicopter a few years back to open a tourist facility over there. The Russians have adopted Zoroastrianism, and they say Zarathustra was their own. Not the Soviets, but the Russians anyway. So this was an important site, and they were really protecting their resources. Like, for example, they had developed fortified settlements to protect the pasture lands and also to protect their copper mines. By this time, it was past the Neolithic age. They were developing alloys made of copper and arsenic. Bronze was still not discovered. And the archaeological remains show that they had been turned into industrial centers that specialized in metal production. But the most important thing that the Sintashta are famous for is their war chariot. This developed a brand new technology, and many of these people were hired as mercenaries in the Mesopotamian society, and they became extremely good soldiers. The thing about these chariots is that the Ratha, which is the Sanskrit word, or Avastan is also Retha, is the Indo-Iranian term for the spoke wheel chariot of antiquity. It derives from a collective Retha to a Proto-Indo-European word roto for wheel. That's a rotation that comes from there. The dot in front of each word indicates that these words are not found in any written records, but were sort of developed from this idea of historical linguistics, how they have these rules to work backwards. The steppe chariot was built entirely for speed and was usually driven by a single man. It was made by skilled carpenters. It required a specially trained team of fast and strong horses, and most important, it required a talent, skill, and time and resources for warriors to practice driving the whole team through a turn, and at the same time, keeping balance in a bouncing backless vehicle. And in war, it also required the charioteer to throw javelins. This meant that a single man had to control the horses with just one hand while throwing the javelin with the full force of his body with the other arm. If he had to switch to a bow and arrow, then they had the skill enough to tie the reins around their waist and control the horses that way and use the bow and arrow from the chariot. Now you'd wonder that in spite of this, how come the guy on horseback didn't have an advantage? But the problem was that if you were on horseback, and then this was the age before the stirrups were discovered, if you have ever ridden a horse, you would probably realize this. If you had to throw a javelin from a horseback, you would lose your balance and fall off your horse. So the charioteer had a distinct advantage. Also in those days, the bows were about 5 and 6 feet long. So if you were on horseback and you were shooting an arrow on one side, and then suddenly you had to shoot an arrow on the other side, by the time you swung your bow around, the guy in the chariot would get you. And therefore, the chariot became a very important tool in their military force. These guys required so much practice to become good charioteers, and they had to have a skill and so on, that they became the, shall we say, the chiefs of their society. And when they died, they were buried like this with their horses and their chariots. This one is on left is a cartoon, but on the right-hand side is an actual pencil drawing of a Sintasta grave. You can see the remains of the poor guy, and the two horses' heads are buried with him, and they had the forelocks of the horses in a particular manner. Also, there are all his tools are lying around in there, and they are shown on the right-hand side. By the time they have developed the technology to have these shafts and the whole spearhead in one piece, and they still use flint for arrowheads. But the most important thing is that these are the cheek pieces that they use for the horses, where the bits went through and the reins were connected to them. Imprints of the chariot wheels are still found in this grave over here. So the Sintasta were the actual origins of the Aryans. Within the steppe society, a person was identified as an Arya if he sacrificed to the right gods in the right way using the correct forms of the traditional hymns and prayers. This is according to Anthony. It's a direct quote from him. If he did not, then that person was a Dasyu, and later on in Iran, such a person was called an Anarya. But in my opinion, the Arya were not identified by race or physical appearance, but probably by ethnicity. They shared the same culture, language, beliefs, and history. So there were people of different races who were incorporated into this society. The second event, as I described before, requirement for developing the Aryan characteristics is an urban culture. And the best fit that we have is this Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, which is actually on the edge of the Iranian plateau, right over here. And by 3500 BCE, there was a very advanced culture called the Namaska. Sorry, my hands are shaking, but anyway, it's right over there. These people had migrated hundreds of kilometers east into the Zaravushan Valley, which is a tributary of the Amu Darya River. The Aral Sea is up here off my map, but the Amu Darya River is shown here. Zaravushan is a tributary. The reason they came here and established this place called Sarazam was they were mining turquoise. And this turquoise was exported all the way to Egypt. All this happened, I guess most of it was done through these societies that lived on the Iranian plateau. Another thing that I would like to point out is that by 2500 BCE, these people found that there was a really very fertile oasis at the point where the Margiana River, coming from the mountains in Afghanistan, flows into the Karakum Desert and deposits this silt, forming an 80 by 100 kilometer wide area of very fertile land. So there was a huge city-states established, and on the right-hand side are drawings made by archaeologists to show what these urban centers look like. They were fairly advanced in that way. The other thing about the BMSC complex is that This was by Sariandi, who was an archaeologist who discovered these sites. It was a Soviet archaeologist. That he thinks that these were Proto-Zoroastrians. They had a cult of fire and a cult of water. They used the water filtered for ritual ablutions that they brought from the Margiana River. There was a cult of earth. They took great pains to see that all the dead bodies were not in contact with the earth. They exposed the dead. And there was a cult of Soma Homa. This is one important theory, that the Aryans did not adopt the Soma Homa, which has come into our culture also, and it came from these people. They adopted it from them when they came into contact with them. And they found 5 temples in there with evidence of this Homa plant that they used in the temples. Vara, which is also used in Avesta, is a round structure with 9 openings and then 6 in the second wall and a 3, I think last 3 in the center has 3. The similar structure was found at Dashli 3, which is another one of these BMAC sites. Another third event that we have to have for the formation of these Aryan cultures is that finally these people from the steppes invaded these urban cultures and entered this Zaravashan valley here. You can see the T and the T. Those are known tin deposits that are still known today. By this time, bronze was developed, and they needed the tin to combine with the copper to make bronze weapons. These people established really very urbanized centers, again in the Zaravashan Valley, began to develop all these technologies for making bronze weapons, and also bred really fine horses, not only here, but in the Fergana Valley, which is just about north of there. The other thing that happened also is that because these people became very good metal producers, these metal products were in great demand in all the cultures that were south of here in Mesopotamia and in Elam, which was a very large culture in southwestern Iran. But most of the trading had to be done through this BMAC complex. But in spite of the fact that they had trading relationships, from time to time, they would also raid them. Finally, the BMAC cultures became, shall we say, partly abandoned, and a degree of assimilation began to take place. Also, in the Zaravashan Valley, these poor guys, the residents of these BMAC cultures, abandoned the settlements at Sarazam and Zaman Baba, and the Tugai became a new settlement for these steppe dwellers. Another important thing is that linguists have discovered that 55 words in the Proto-Indo-Iranian languages were borrowed from the BMAC. Hustra, Zarathustra, is a word for camel, which comes from this language of the BMAC, which was a non-Indo-European language. There is also the word for Soma, which was called Anchu, and Indra, which is a god that the BMAC culture had, not the Aryans. But it became part of the Aryan culture because of the absorption from the BMAC. And the BMAC fortresses and cities were an excellent source for this vocabulary because they already had irrigation, agriculture, and they had camels. And the cult of Soma, Homa, and of Indra became a strong component of the Proto-Indo-European language. So between 1800 and 1600, the Sintasta and the Petroka gave way to another steppe culture, which was called the Andronova culture, which had a wider distribution. They went all the way from the Caspian Sea into Siberia and also entered Central Asia. This shows you a picture of some of the technologies that were going on. They discovered bellows that they can use to raise the temperature of the furnace and therefore able to make bronze weapons and all. They were also pouring spearheads and javelin heads from cast made from bronze. Another event that occurred was there was a second wave of these Andronova people intruding into the Zaravashan Valley. They also formed what is called the Tezabagiab culture in Khorasmia. This was a very big oasis right about here. Aral Sea is right there, and you can see the dark area on the satellite map, which became the Tezabagiab culture. And the walled cities of the BMAC by this time were partly abandoned, and the steppe pastoralist lifestyle with chiefs and patron clans and obligation now became part of that culture too. Most important, during this time, a unique event occurred. That was the split of the Indo-Iranian unity. This was because the Old Indic dialects developed in the zone south of the Zaravashan Valley, which is shown in the blue area here, while the Iranian dialects, or the archaic Iranian of the Avesta, developed in this area shown in red. And at the end of this period, the BMAC urban cultures were completely abandoned by 1600 BCE. They could no longer survive, and two things happened. Indo-Aryans moved away from Central Asia. Part of them went all the way west to Syria and formed the Mitanni Empire. And the rest of them, of course, entered India as the Rigvedic Aryans. The Irano-Aryans, part of our ancestors, at this time entered the Iranian plateau. So all these things that I mentioned, can we use this now to bracket Zarathustra Aristotle's time frame? And I think it was between 2100 and 1600 BCE based on what we see. I'm just showing this picture. I've just taken this from the internet. This is probably represents these mercenary warriors which were operating in Mesopotamia. They did not have horses at that time over there. They were still using mules for their chariots. So the BMAC disappearance in 1600 BCE provides a terminal date, and its beginnings in 2100 BCE provides a starting point for Zarathustra and Vishtaspa, or the Aryan culture. The import of 55 keywords into the Indo-Iranian language from the BMAC culture, and the import of the concept of Soma, Homa, and Indra into the Indo-Iranian religion suggests that the BMAC culture was a vital ingredient in defining the Indo-Iranian characteristics. And the Sintasta culture that I showed you before in red, near the Ural Mountains, this was a first known culture with the typical ethnic indicators and cultural characteristics described as Aryan. And these cultures now exhibit in the archaeological record the same Aryan characteristics as described in the Rigveda and the Old Avesta. And there are two key elements in the Aryan society that are mentioned in the Gathas. One is the pastoral society, which was preyed upon by the elite chariot warriors. They were cattle-tending pastoralists, which are called Vastriya in Avesta, in the Gathas. And the spatial term Nar was used in Yashna 28.8 to designate a class of warriors designated as slayers of men, harmers of men, and livestock on peaceful settlements. They were identified as fellow Iranians, and they were called Avastriya, or non-herdsmen or non-pastoralists of Suyan. Another important thing, Zarathustra in the Gathas rails against these Karpans and the Uchig, and because these were the special classes of priests who aided these Avastriya, or these warriors, in performing special rites to bring martial success and shared in probably the spoils of the raid. So there is, however, a possibility, and I have to consider this point, that indeed 1900 BCE rather than 2100 BCE is the earliest possible date, because of the fact that the Old Avesta, because of the tie-in with the Rigveda, essentially. The Old Avesta of the archaic Iranian and of the Gathas and the Old Indic of the Rigveda evolved from the Proto-Iranian in the contact zone of Central Asia in here. Contact, therefore they may only vary in little in grammar and differ slightly only in phonetics and lexicography. But these differences are easily decipherable, and in fact, that is one reason why the Avesta was finally able to be translated. But this association is made in spite of the fact, and we have seen this already, that the Old Indic developed south of the Zaravashan Bactrian contact zone about 1800 to 1600 BCE, separating from and developing from the Iranian dialects. This is according to Anthony, the archaeologist. And therefore, it is more likely that the archaic Iranian is an older language. Also, another important point is that in spite of the fact that the contents of the earliest portion of the Rig Veda, that is when it was composed, not compiled, it was happened mostly at a time when these Rig Vedic Aryans were already in the Hindu, past the Hindu Kush or just north of it and in the Punjab. And we know that these Indo-Aryans had already left the contact zone with the BMAC in Central Asia by 1600 BCE. So if there was a correlation with Zarathustra, you give a century or two for language diversion and composition. I would say the earliest possible date of the Gathas is, I should say, 1900 instead of 1800. 1900 to 1700 BCE would put that date based on this consideration. Important question. If this close relationship with the Rig Veda did exist during Zarathustra's time, then there should be mention of these old Indic speakers in the Old Avesta, Gathas, and the Yasna Hapta in Haiti, which is about the same time. But so far as I can see, there really is none. Conversely, if the archaic Iranians of the Gathas were related to the Rig Vedic Aryans, you should see something in the Rig Veda about Zarathustra and Vishtaspa. Most authorities sort of don't take this seriously, but there is a reference to Jarutha in the Rig Vedic book 7, and you can see 7 verse 1, 7, and 9, 6, and book 10, 80-3, where Jarutha is portrayed as a demon destroyed by Agni. And according to Hodiwala, Vishtaspa is mentioned as Ishteswa in Rig Vedic book 1, hymn 122-13, in reference to what can princes do against the protection of Mitra. So these references in the Rig Veda refer to him, and they suggest an animosity, which could be explained if the Rig Vedic Aryans were part of the Indo-Iranian society that was unreceptive to Zarathustra's teachings. And since these references are in the books or the mandalas 7 and 10, which are from the period 1500 to 1200 BCE, they are composed when the Indo-Aryans were already out of Central Asia, signifying that they were referring to events in their past history. So some conclusions and justifications. I think Zarathustra's time was between 1900 and 1700. This period best satisfies the three requirements that I've already stated: steppe society and urban society, and intrusion of the steppe society into the urban environment. The Gathas also reflect an opposition between the believers in Zarathustra's teachings and unbelievers, and between Iranians and not foreigners, according to Mallory, the famous archaeologist. Old Indic-speaking Indo-Aryans are not mentioned in the Gathas. Most likely, Zarathustra lived a century or two before the emergence of the Indo-Aryans and the Old Indic language that occurred between 1800 and 1600 BCE, because according to Anthony, the Old Indic dialects evolved and separated from the Iranian dialects. Therefore, the Indo-Aryans are also evolved from the portion of Iranian society that practiced the old religion and refused to accept Zarathustra's teachings, perhaps emerging a century or more after Zarathustra. So what I'm saying is that both of these people were part of the Iranian society. One group followed Zarathustra's teaching, the other didn't, and the ones that didn't were the ancestors of these Rig Vedic Aryans. Or the Iranian-speaking ancestors of the Rig Vedic Aryans, that's a possibility we have to consider, also were too isolated from Zarathustra's location to be involved in his religious revolution. Whatever the case may be, this frees us from the very close ties to the Rig Vedic composition, space, and time. So I conclude that Zarathustra lived between 1900 and 1700 BCE, maybe as late as 1600. Location in Central Asia, shown in the magenta. Essentially, it is in the Amu Darya basin, starting from the Khorasmia, near the Aral Sea, all the way down into Bactria, and all the way up into Fergana Valley. Another thing to remember is that the upper class of the society had roots in the steppe population, and names ending with aspa, like Vishtaspa and Loraspa, belong to this ruling class. Another important point I'd like to point before I end is what bugged the heck out of me when I began to read Western scholars or even Parsi scholars say that Zarathustra's time was in the 1000 BCE or later. I have two really reasons to say this was not so. This is a quote from Zaner, The Dawn and Twilight of Zoroastrianism. It's a very good book. I recommend that you read it. In his words, the language of the old Avesta very soon seems to have become a purely liturgical language which is no longer spoken and only very imperfectly understood. 900 to 600 BCE is the time assigned to Zarathustra by some scholars like Mallory. Many Western scholars still write about this. Thing to remember is that in that period, this is probably just before the Achaemenid times and during the Achaemenid times, the Magi first appear in the historical records. They were responsible for the drawing up of the Videvidat, or the most portion of it. And this is part of the non-Gathic Avesta. And again, quoting Zaner, he says that indeed we have the impression that the authors of the Videvidat are not only writing in a language that is not their own, but are doing so in one of the rudiments of whose grammar they had quite failed to master. This would indicate that if Zarathustra composed the Gathas and the Yasna Haptandhaiti was also composed as late as the first millennium BCE, between, say, 1000 and 0, during the time of the Magi, then they would not have been composed in the old Avestan language, a language more or less extinct by that time, except for liturgical use due to the oral tradition. Second reason, one Soviet archaeologist called Kuzmina, she has written a big book called The Origin of the Indo-Aryans. In that book, she says that by 1200 to 1000 BCE, the climate on the steppes had changed so dramatically, it had become so dry that all the settlements had been abandoned and people had taken up to nomadism again. It was also the time of the discovery of the composite bow. This is a Parthian bow, that picture I'm showing, but it was very similar to that. What did allow them to do? These were the people who became the ancestors of the Scythians, the Sakas and the Masagade, which spread all over the steppes. They formed massed armies armed with these composite bows, and they began to raid into areas all over Eurasia. What they did, though, was that by 1600, as we have seen, the Indo-Aryans had already escaped to Syria and down into Rigveda, so they escaped this calamity. The Irano-Aryans, our ancestors, were still over here in Central Asia, and this red arrow shows where these massed armies of nomads came in. They invaded Central Asia, pushed the Irano-Aryans out, and according to T. Coelier Young, who wrote a very good paper in 1960s, he was one who was looking at the ceramic remains on the Iranian plateau. And based on his record of the ceramics and the record of the Assyrians, who recorded the Medes and the Persians in their conquest, I think that that is what happened. These Irano-Aryans were pushed out, formed the Medes, and then later arrivals pushed further south and became the Persians. This would explain not only the origin of the Medes and the Persians, but also would explain why Vishtaspa's kingdom disappears completely from the record. Thank you. Okay. I don't know if you have time for questions.
Hello, my name is Firdosh Mehta. I'm supposed to be the chair of this session. But I'm sorry, I apologize. I went hunting for the speaker award and it took me some time. But I have it in my hand now, so I feel a little better that I can do my job. I was supposed to introduce Pilsum, but I think from what you heard, he needs no introduction. He has done many, many years of study. Being an archaeologist himself in his profession, this is his heart's desire and liking that he enjoys. We will take some questions for sure, but there are a couple of things I wanted you all to reflect from what you saw. Is you saw a lot of the Russian terms or Cyrillic terms that he brought up, the Va in the Petrova and all that, and the original name of Zarathustra's mother is Dugdova. So there is a good chance that is the region where Zarathustra could have come. One more thing to support what Pilsum is trying to say. Any questions?
I see that it has been established and you've shown us, you've shown one of the slides where Zarathustra's existence was between now, that between 1700 and 1900 BC, and maybe in the late 1600s. What exactly was the year you think it was that he was around? And the exact, more or less exact location from all the slides you've shown us is where do you think was his going around the whole area of the Middle East?
I think that there's a multiplicity of questions here. I think the best we can do is to sort of point to the area that I shown in magenta, which is a vast area. And probably he may have been in one of these areas, or Vishtaspa's influence may have been there at that time. And it is impossible to really pinpoint and say that's where he was. There is nothing left in the archaeological record. And unfortunately, now that there's an awareness among the archaeological community about where to look, unfortunately, that area is no longer accessible. You can see what the heck is going on in that part of the world. So until that happens and we have the ability to do more archaeological studies, it may not be possible. Also, I always ask myself, what is it that these archaeologists are going to find that's going to convince us that that indeed is there? They didn't have any writing over there. They didn't leave any records on stone or anything like this. So it's almost impossible to really pinpoint.
But it was within that area.
Yeah.
And one quick one.
But please keep your question.
Yeah, very quick.
We have to get to something.
What is the BMAC supposed to mean?
Oh.
BMAC.
The Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex.
Please, short questions and questions. We'll go in this direction. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Yeah.
What archaeological evidence do you have to support? What archaeological evidence do you have to support that the chariot driver wrapped the reins around his waist when he had to shoot the bow and arrow to stabilize him in the chariot?
That's a very interesting question. There was a documentary I saw a little while back, I think on one of the channels, in which these people are trying to actually build a chariot exactly like it was. But the biggest difficulty that, for example, they had was the harnessing of the horse. But anyway, finally they were able to do this, and they began to literally practice and see what they could do. And this was the only possibility. Another thing is that in the historical records, like you see in the Egyptian and those pictographs that you see, one-man chariot came to an end fairly quickly. Once they were able to develop a width in the chariot, two men were possible to put two men in there, in which case one guy always had the reins, the other guy was the one who threw the javelins and all. And then the Egyptians had three-man chariots also. So that's a good question. Yeah.
Are there any astronomical events that could be tied to historical records that could help with the dating?
I think there was a good talk given by the gentleman over there just this morning.
Yeah, I mean, other than the Nowruz and the date of the sunrise on Nowruz, other than that, comets or supernovas or stuff like that could be then tied back?
The archaeological community and the historical linguistics communities consider themselves to be, shall we say, they're not interested in astrology or even astronomy complex. It is possible, but I don't think that I've come across any evidence like that.
Greek and Roman historians dated Zarathustra at 6500 BC. And there was a recent sort of email which I got. I don't know how credible that is, but it said something about recent archaeological findings have suggested he could have lived that far back. What do you think about all that? I mean, do you think it's possible you could have had someone living that far back at 6500 BC? I mean, Zarathustra.
I think in my paper that I put in the Faizana Journal, there is a map that shows the spread of the ice sheets in Europe. The Ice Age ended around a nomadic existence like these people had. It's just not possible. As a geologist, I don't think that is possible.
Just a couple quick comments and a quick question.
No comments, please.
Yes, no. So you have settled people, and the big tension in the Gathas is between settled people and nomadic peoples. And nomadic peoples and settled peoples have very different sets of values. And if you look at it in a faith system, Abrahamic faiths are more tribal-based. They have more of a stress on equality between all of their members. From what we've seen in Gathas, Zarathustra kind of emphasizes settled agriculture-based lifestyle. That's a different set of values. That leads to inequality. That also leads to more of a class system. So I'm wondering, from what you've seen in Gathas and the archaeology, what is kind of the commentary on what a society should be, equal or unequal, and how much equality or how much inequality should there be?
Maybe make a quick comment on this. I think that from what little I read about this, the Gathas are actually kind of a cry for social justice. This was a society which was in great trouble, and Zarathustra, when he's in the Athavero Pereira, Daregopio, I think he's referring to these people, these pastoralists, the common man of that day. So essentially, I think what Zarathustra was trying to do in his Gathas was to find a way of providing some relief to these poor pastoralists who were being continuously harassed by this segment of society. And this was part of their own society. This was an amalgamation of the steppe culture with the urban culture. The urban culture had been sort of subdued and become part of this amalgamation.
I would please request anybody to beat Pilsum out of here so that the next session can start. And Pilsum, it is my pleasure and honor to share this token of our appreciation with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation.